This flank steak quesadillas and talk about immigration policy. About to give the camera to my girlfriend for filming. There we go. All right, so what we need before we get started, we need a little bit of ghee or butter or olive oil, depending on what your preferred lubricant is. Salt, obviously, garlic powder, onion powder if you're feeling sexy, and make some cayenne pepper. Don't need this, but it's nice. Also, you don't need limes, but we're gonna put some limes on because we're feeling fancy. Tortillas. Today's tortilla is the blue corn tortilla from HEB. You can use any tortilla you want. I would recommend the seed oil-free one. I would also recommend an organic one, which that is not, but beggars can't be choosers. Organic cheese, I would also recommend that organic mozzarella from Whole Foods. Probably overpaid for that one, but it is what it is. We're gonna have 2 skillets today. We're gonna put the tortilla skillet on the lower flame and the meat skillet on the higher flame. So first step, we're going to start getting this skillet hot. So that'll probably take a couple minutes, and then we're gonna season the steak. Now, while we season the steak, we're going to talk through immigration policy. Immigration policy has ranged in the United States. We're taught in school that our immigration policy was historically racist, but of course, they didn't think about it at the time. They thought it was prudent, no matter how racist people retrospectively look at the policy. There's a lot of reasons why immigration policy was structured the way it was. And so I think, as a Chinese American, we can talk through the Chinese Exclusion Act, motivations for it, and various policies through the 20th century up until today, where there is no basically immigration policy. Everybody can just come in, and apparently they can vote too. So we'll start with immigration historically was not an issue of racist people versus woke. It was actually an issue of the rich versus the poor, as you can imagine. And that issue has been rebranded in a couple of other ways. So as you can imagine, immigration or labor, like anything, follows a market type system where the more of it you have, the lower the price is. And so historically, there's always been a battle between workers and the companies who pay them. And one way that workers have sought to increase the wages that they make is by reducing the amount of workers. This can be done through licensing, right? Wall Street does this, where not anybody can become a broker. You need to go through some hurdles to sell securities, and that restricts the amount of brokerage firms, banks. It restricts competition, and ultimately allows the players who are licensed to charge more for what they do. But this has historically also applied to, sorry, put that there. Oh, I forgot how much stuff we've added. Okay, so we need to do the cayenne pepper right now. I think that's enough. Okay, so that's getting hot. As this gets hot, put this on. Okay, we're also going to turn that on. We can put metal on the hex pad, so we're just going to let that ghee melt for a second as we take out the corn tortillas. Okay, so poor people, working class people in the United States, like today, similar to the workers in the Midwest who voted for Trump because they didn't like NAFTA and they didn't like their pensions and jobs going away. Workers historically have sought to limit the influx of immigrants to the United States because immigrants are very frequently willing to work for less. In fact, the big reason why globalists want more immigration and want more H-1B visas and want you to feel racist for wanting less immigration is because they want to pay workers less, because that's how companies make money, is they charge the same or higher prices and they pay their employees less. So it's actually capitalism that has convinced you that you're racist for not wanting more immigration. And so historically, as much as you can look at certain political cartoons featuring Asian Americans and saying that they're obviously racist for wanting fewer Chinese people, it's also the case that poor people didn't want cheap labor undercutting them. Because if poor people had cheap labor undercutting them, then they would stay poor. They would have no bargaining power. And so a big reason why there was a push to have a Chinese Exclusion Act is because the poor people didn't want more competition in the labor market. They wanted to exclude people poorer than them, and there happened to be at the time an influx of cheap Chinese labor. The other thing that occurred historically, which probably not supposed to talk about, though they did do tuberculosis testing at Ellis Island, at least according to The Godfather, which I look at as a historically accurate movie, poor people have diseases at a higher rate than non-poor people. And so if you're bringing in your poor and huddled masses, there's a good chance you're bringing in more than just poor and huddled masses. There's a good chance they will transport diseases from their homeland, and it's only human nature to be suspicious of outsiders who may come harboring diseases. So we have the Chinese Exclusion Act, which existed for, I don't know, I guess a couple of decades. It wasn't short. And policy for a majority of the time when America is described as a melting pot. America's a melting pot. France gave us the Statue of Liberty because we were such a beacon of liberty and anybody could come. Well, you have to realize that the North American continent did not have as many people as any other continent, any other continent with a functioning economy, right? Australia has fewer people than the North American continent, so Antarctica. But the North American continent and the Americas had fewer people. So in order to develop an economy, we needed to figure out how to get more people over here. We had more of a demand for labor than any European country. So I'm just spreading this around because if the bottom gets too dry, then it will just curl up. And so you'll see right now, this is not going to be evenly cooked. See how this is cooked more than that? That's what we want to avoid. So we're just spreading this around a little bit. Okay, so when America was described as a melting pot, people from all over could come to America. This wasn't actually the case, right? America had, at the time, a preference for European immigrants because, although they don't teach this in school, it was widely known at the time, it was, so widely accepted that it would probably have been considered self-evident that if you disrupt the culture of the United States so much, then they're not going to assimilate. And so if you have people who don't assimilate to American culture, you're going to have a broken culture. So one thing that was unique about the United States is not only was it home to a large majority, or a large percentage of immigrants, these immigrants would come to the United States and they would learn English. They wanted to be American, right? They had a dream of being American. They saved up a lot of money for them. And they came over to be American. All right, so now that we have flipped the tortillas over, we're going to start putting cheese. Put cheese on these. We're only going to put a little bit of cheese on each side because these are actually going to get sandwiched together. And we're going to basically make quesadilla sandwiches. So the Europeans would assimilate, and the Germans would become Americans, and the French would become Americans, and the Brits would become Americans, and people from Western Europe would come over. They'd want to be American, and they become American. Russians become Americans, and then during the '60s, it was decided that this policy was racist. This policy that we had of preferring, so we had quotas, where our immigration policy would give greater preference to people from European countries compared to people from any other country. And then this was also before the welfare system had come into play. So put a little bit more grease on that pan. So in the '60s, Johnson massively expanded the welfare state, but in addition to massively expanding the welfare state, they changed immigration policy to where it didn't overtly favor Europeans. And obviously people who dissented from that were saying, well, this is going to change the United States, it's going to change American culture, and they were constantly told that, oh, this is a fallacy, like it's not, you're overreacting. You'll notice this is a constant theme for people who are culturally conservative. Anytime they oppose some sort of change in policy, they're reassured that they're overreacting, and 30 years later, probably the most extreme person who dissented from a policy change would have actually been the correct one as far as how things may have changed. And so, for the last 50 or so years, our immigration policy has not been a Eurocentric immigration policy, and part of that is because a lot of Americans don't like the fact that WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Americans, have had historically a lot of control over the United States. So, Jewish Americans, which would include the people on my dad's side, did not like the fact that they felt like they were a minority in the United States compared to the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And so anything that could be done to dilute the political strength of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants was seen as a good thing. This is why Jewish people have historically allied with many minorities on political issues, because anything to dilute the influence of WASP Americans has been historically seen as a positive by folks on the left. And so you can look at what's happening right now with the massive influx of illegal immigrants right now, and you can think, well, how can anybody want this? And the reality is, the less power white Americans have, the happier the dissident groups are, because it shows a break from the historical norms, a break from all that they consider to be bad with the United States. And so most recently, the Democratic Party has played this game for a couple decades where they tried to convince poor Americans that they stood by them. Right? They wanted to convince poor Americans that they stood by them, but they also wanted the minority vote. And so this would have been challenging when you take into account the more immigration you have, the less bargaining power working class Americans have. So how do you bridge the gap between working class Americans benefiting from less immigration, but also wanting to be seen as friendly, having a friendly policy to minorities and immigrants, is you have to lie. You have to talk out of both sides of your mouth. You have to say that we support immigrants, but we support the working class. But realistically, you can't support both unless you just want to give free shit to everybody. Then I guess you could support both, even though the free shit will ultimately result in inflation. It'll hurt the poor people more than it'll hurt the rich people. It was a policy that was designed to do a lot. It was a policy that was designed to be talking out of both sides of their mouth, And a lot of historical Democrats, people who've been voting for the Democrats since the 60s, couldn't realize it. They did not realize that the left actually wanted mass immigration because it was such a break from the Democratic Party that supported labor unions and the negotiating power of labor that they couldn't see how the Democratic Party could have changed. But if you want an example, you can say Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders, obviously, 2016 Bernie Sanders understood how open borders would be terrible for the working class. But I think by 2020, somebody talked to him, and he was convinced that the greatest risk for America, I'm going to take that off, it looks like pretty charred on all sides. By 2020, Bernie Sanders was convinced that the greatest risk for America was white supremacy, obviously. And so he was willing to give up his support for the bargaining position of the working class and take a further left view on immigration. So we're going to cut this lime. This will be fancy. I'm going to sprinkle it on. Some lime juice on that steak. All right. Then take these, start taking them off. And so historically, there's always been, up until maybe 10 years or so, there's always been a pretty big delineation between legal immigration and illegal immigration, partially because a lot of legal immigrants do not like illegal immigrants because they know how challenging it was for them to go through the immigration process the legal way, and people resent people who cut lines. And so the Democratic Party had to figure out, well, how do we increase illegal immigration without the legal immigrants knowing that we're actually increasing illegal immigration? That's going to make them not like us. And so, if you follow left-wing narratives, which I don't, outside of just talking to my dad and figuring out what kind of insane things he believes, apparently on the left, they believe that the reason why there's more illegal immigration now isn't because the Democrats are wanting it. They think it's actually because of climate change. They think there's so much climate disruption in the world that all of these illegal immigrants just have nowhere to go because the Republicans refuse to take action to address the climate. And so this is actually an interesting way of arguing. And this is actually something you should note if you're an aspiring totalitarian, is if any of your policies are going against you, it's always the fault of the people who didn't give you enough power. You'll always get more power if the reason why you didn't get your way was because you had to compromise. So it's very circular reasoning, but just pay attention for it. It will always exist. Okay, so this steak has been sitting for a couple minutes. What we're going to do right now, we're going to cut against the grain. We're going to start with the thinner side because the thinner side is going to cook faster. That's good. Good job, Alex. Chef Alex doesn't miss, obviously. Juicy, juicy, juicy. 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 Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to cut this widthwise because we got to put these little steak chunks in the quesadilla. And then, one question that I posed on Twitter earlier today is, as a mental exercise, if you wanted to think, how would Democrats address immigration different? How would their views on immigration change, or how would their policies on immigration change if 80% of immigrants voted for Republicans? Which may happen if they get a little bit crazy on this gender ideology, and the immigrants are convinced that their children are going to be undergoing sex changes if they vote for Democrats. We see a very, very different policy regarding the border if a majority of immigrants, legal or illegal, were to be expected to vote Republican. And I think you would also see a very different policy or very different tune by more Republicans. A lot of Republicans like immigration because immigration results in cheaper labor. But more Republicans would want a more open border, obviously, if more immigrants voted for them. And so a lot of Democrats are a little bit delusional, but they are delusional with respect to the incentives for a governing party to enforce the law when their power is contingent upon them not enforcing the law. That's what Upton Sinclair said, I think in The Jungle. You know, it's very difficult to convince a man what his salary or power depends on him not understanding. And so, you know, the corollary to that for Democrats, Democratic politicians would be it's very difficult to convince a Democratic politician what his political seat, what his seat in Congress or his seat in the executive branch depends on him not understanding. And that is, you know, the risk of unchecked immigration into the United States. Okay. One thing that immigration has probably helped us create is delicious Tex-Mex, which we have right here. We just look at that. Look at how beautiful that is. That's fabulous. All right. Take one of these. We'll double it over. Oops. This is basically a taco burger. Flank steak quesadillas. All right. Let's see how Chef Alex did. Chef Alex didn't miss. Thank you for tuning in. Till next Wednesday, this has been Live Stream Lunch. See you then.